So you want to start riding off-road. Well, the right bike can make a huge difference, and the wrong bike can also make a huge difference. I want to make this video to guide people through the process of buying potentially their first, second, or even third off-road bike. I want to talk about key considerations before you make that big purchase. From your riding style to the terrain that you're going to be riding on, all the way to your budget, these are all important factors before you go ahead and pull the trigger on buying something. In my opinion, the first thing you should consider is where you're going to be riding and the type of terrain that is going to be. If you're East Coast, you're going to be doing a lot of flowy woods trails. If you're West Coast, you're probably going to be doing a little bit more desert riding, which is a very different experience. But more important than terrain is your riding style. What do you want to do? Are you looking to cruise the scenic trails or tackle some insane obstacles? Or do you want to do both? Do you prefer a smooth dirt path? Maybe a rocky, dry riverbed, maybe you want to go to the dunes, or perhaps you want to ride motocross. These are all important factors before you go ahead and pull the trigger on your bike. Because while a one dirt bike can handle them all, sometimes you'd be surprised just how little you need. For most people, it's very tempting to go buy the biggest, baddest, top of the line motorcycle, and they really don't need it. So let's go ahead and talk about bike types and their purpose. Now, there are a ton of different words used to describe motorcycles that go off-road. Standard, I just say dirt bike. Typically, anything that goes on the dirt, in my opinion, is a dirt bike. But there are still many different types of dirt bikes. One being a pit bike. I got the opportunity to ride one of these for about a month. This bike was very approachable to a vertically inclined person or a beginner in general. It was the Honda CRF 150F. And it was without a doubt the most approachable bike I've ever ridden. It was super simple to work on, super simple to maintain, and like I said before, I could touch the ground at any time. It was also very fun to ride because it was so agile that I could really flick it around and do what I wanted to do without really thinking about it too much. So even though I'm not really a beginner, I have a ton of fun on a beginner bike, otherwise known as a pit bike. And then there are trail bikes, which to me is an odd thing to say because all bikes are trail bikes. But these trail bikes are designed to be less aggressive than a motocross bike or less aggressive than a cross-country racing bike. Think about it as I want to go on scenic trails, but I also kind of want to flow and go a little bit quicker. It's like the next step up from a pit bike. A pit bike is something that you can learn on. You can still have a ton of fun on a pit bike, but if you really have had your pit bike for a couple of years and maybe now you want to step it up, now you're going to be looking at a trail bike. A trail bike can be a serious weapon in the hands of a good rider, so I would never put a trail bike down below any other type of motorcycle. They're just set up to be softer and more approachable, and the power isn't all up top. It's more linear so that you have more kind of a smooth experience while riding it. Now, dual sport bikes are, to me, an interesting segment because dual sport means that it can go on and off road legally. And while yes, any motorcycle with plates and turn signals and a headlight can have dual sport tires put on it and you can ride it off-road, a dual sport typically is a dirt bike. It's more geared towards dirt that has had plates put on it. A dual sport dirt bike is a little bit more heavy than a non-dual sport dirt bike, and it shows. I know a lot of people will buy a dual sport and have a great time, and for most people a dual sport is where most people are comfortable. They have nice seats, they're pretty comfortable overall, single cylinder engines, so they're very simple overall to work on, and they're usually pretty inexpensive. You can get these from almost all of the major brands, and most of them are are very approachable prices, even new, and I always recommend buying used, so they're very approachable bikes. So if you want a super fun street bike that you can use to go to and from work, go to the store, and then on the weekends ride to the trails and have an amazing time on the trails, then ride home and do it all over again, dual sports are definitely for you. And now we're starting to get into the type of bikes that I personally like. Then you have cross-country bikes. I'm going to bundle cross-country and enduro into one just for the sake of simplicity. Enduro bikes are a little bit softer than cross-country bikes, but they're both very aggressive for a beginner rider. If you're a beginner rider but you want a hardcore bike, you're going to want to look at enduro bikes. I'm talking KTM EXC, could be a 2-stroke or it could be EXC F 4-stroke. or a Honda CRF 250 RX. There are a ton of different brands, Sherco, Beta, they all make great enduro bikes, and I definitely recommend looking at those. Husqvarna and Gas as well, I don't want to forget anybody here. Now, an enduro bike is basically a race-ready bike. Make no jokes, don't fool yourself. If you're thinking, I want something that won't hurt me, these bikes will. These are definitely dangerous motorcycles, and they're very fast. My 300cc two-stroke dirt bike is more than capable of going 70 miles an hour off-road without even thinking about it. Their suspensions are incredible, their frames are built for off-road racing, and their engines are extremely aggressive. The biggest downside to an enduro bike or a cross-country motorcycle is that the maintenance required for them is substantially higher than all of the other bikes that we've talked about. The last dirt bike style on the list that I want to discuss is a motocross bike. A motocross bike compared to an enduro bike is the ultimate in aggression. It has a much smaller gas tank because you don't need much fuel when you're doing motocross. You usually will ride for a maximum of 30 minutes and then you stop and you can put more fuel in. The power delivery of a motocross engine is extremely aggressive. You're either all the way revved out or you're hunting for more power. So on a motocross bike, you have to be aggressive to get the most out of it. Their suspensions are substantially harder than a cross-country or an enduro bike. It is a noticeable difference. They do turn in well, and they handle high speed substantially better than a softer enduro bike. Overall, a motocross bike is extremely good for motocross tracks, but the second you take it off the motocross track, you're definitely going to realize just how harsh and how aggressive that motorcycle is. And while you can use a motocross bike to go on trails and have a lot of fun, you're definitely going to notice how harsh it is. And if you're an older guy like me, you're gonna hurt the next day more than you would if you purchased a enduro bike. Like vice versa, if you take an enduro bike to a motocross track, which I do, you will notice that it is soft. When you land, you will your suspension will go a lot lower. You won't be able to hit single jumps nearly as hard as the motocross bikes will. And the suspension overall is just going to be kind of sketchy when it comes to some of the stuff that happens on a motocross track. Of course, you can do both on an enduro bike and be perfectly happy, but I think that at any point your riding level will improve to a level where you start to notice that the motocross bike and the enduro bike do have a place. For the beginner though, I don't really think that you'll notice, and I think that you should just go have fun on whatever you get. And now that we've talked about the different types of bikes and you probably have an idea of which one you prefer, there are still some key features that you should consider. In dirt bikes, there are two different types of engines. There are three now, but I'm only going to talk about internal combustion because I don't really know that much about electric and I don't want to act like I do. So there are two different types of engines. There's the 4-stroke and there's the 2-stroke. 2-stroke is considered to be the older technology, and in motocross, it has pretty much all but gone the way of the dodo. It's gone. Some people still ride them and love them. I'm one of those people, but there are specific places for 2-stroke engine. Mainly, the 2-stroke engine is extremely hard to stall. So I ride a 300cc 2-stroke, not because I want all that power, but because I want all that tractorability. A 300cc 2-stroke can have really low RPMs and you can get super good traction through really technical terrain and pretty much lug your way through anything. They're incredible. But at the opposite end of that, a 300cc 2-stroke, when you give it 100% throttle, will 100% do a wheelie, and if you don't know what you're doing, you will end up crashing. So don't think that when I say I like a 300cc 2-stroke because it is luggable, that I'm saying that it doesn't have power or that it isn't super aggressive. It can be both. The 2-stroke is, in my opinion, the perfect bike for the technical riding because it is both. It is both a low-end torque machine that can get you through terrain, just duck, 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 duck. But at the same time, when you give it all the power and it gets up there, it is an extremely aggressive machine, and you can really get some speed put down quickly. A 2-stroke fires twice as often, which is why it's harder to stall, but that's also why it is substantially more aggressive. That's actually the reason they stopped using them in motocross, because the traction was a lot harder to get on a two-stroke. They're just so aggressive that they spin the rear tire very easily, which is why they went the way of the four-stroke. Two-strokes also have substantially worse fuel economy. Because they do explode that gas twice as often, they basically use twice as much fuel. And on the note of two-strokes, there are a few sizes of two-strokes that you can go with. 300 is pretty much the biggest you can get. Obviously, in the past they made up to 500 cc's, but they're very expensive now to get, and I definitely would not recommend them for a beginner. It's more of like a collector's bike at this point. But to make this simpler, we'll talk 125, 250, 300. If you want to go into motocross and you really want a two-stroke, you're either going to buy a 125 or a 250. A 125 two-stroke, you have to be 100% all the time, or there's almost no power anywhere but at the very top. A 250cc motocross bike is an absolute monster, and I would not recommend that for a beginner ever. But it's fun. It's very fun. And a 300 is actually more calm and more tame than a 200. It will have more power, but it has a much more linear power delivery than a 250 motocross bike. A 250 motocross bike is a super aggressive, much higher revving engine than a 300. And while you would think that a 300 is more aggressive because it's a bigger number, that's just not the case. A 300 is actually a little bit more calm and tame. Even though it does have more power, it gives it to you in a way that's more gentle. That's enough about two strokes. That's my passion. Sorry if I went on too long, but then let's get into four strokes. Four-stroke engines are not the same as two-stroke engines, obviously. If I say a 250 two-stroke is an absolute animal, that does not mean that a 250 four-stroke is an absolute animal. In fact, I would recommend most people start on a 250 four-stroke. A 250 four-stroke is a very gentle, but also potentially fun motorcycle. A 250 four-stroke can be very gentle, but it can also be very aggressive. I think that the majority of people that start riding should definitely consider the 250, because a 125 for an adult, a 125 four-stroke for an adult just might be a little bit too slow and might become a hindrance. You can still ride it, you just have to use the clutch a lot more. I think that it'll leave you wanting more. So for four strokes, I would say your starting point should be a 250cc, especially for off-road. A lot of people are very fast on a 250cc dirt bike, but a 250cc dual sport is going to be a little bit slower and substantially more gentle than a 250cc off-road racing bike, like an enduro bike, cross-country, or motocross. Now, there are brands like Honda that make a 300, which is a great happy medium, and I would say for a dual sport rider, if you want to pick a dual sport, that's what you're set on, I would definitely look into the 300cc four-stroke. Kawasaki makes a good one. Honda makes a ton of options in this segment, so the 300cc four-stroke for a dual sport guy is perfect. Trail riding, enduro, or motocross, I would say 250cc four-stroke is really the sweet spot, because a 450 is just a lot to handle. The spec sheets will say that they weigh the same, but when you start to ride one, the only way I can describe it is that the spec sheets don't matter. They really don't feel the same weight. They feel substantially heavier, especially when you go into a corner. Even just a slow corner, a 250 feels fun and agile, while a 450 feels like a handful. I know that the professional riders make them look like they're very easy to ride, and to some people they might be, but they are substantially more difficult to ride than a 250. Most modern 250 four-strokes are incredible machines, and I would bet that any brand that you purchase a 250 from, you're going to be happy with. Again, like I said before with the race bikes, there is more maintenance required, but the difference between maintenance and a two-stroke and a four-stroke is worthy of note. A two-stroke does require more maintenance than a four-stroke, but it is far simpler to do that maintenance yourself on a two-stroke. Another consideration for buying a motorcycle is the suspension. There are a bunch of different types, and it's definitely worth doing your research on. There's whole books written about suspension. But let's just talk about soft versus hard. And there's a lot more that goes into it than that, but just let's oversimplify and say soft versus hard. Soft suspensions are really good for your chill, want to go explore trail rides, and you can push them a little bit and have some fun and still be relatively comfortable. But the more you lean in, the more speed and aggression you put into a softer suspension, the less predictable they get. The wheels start to bounce around and you have less contact. I'm not saying that you can't do it, I'm just saying that if you want a soft suspension, it's because you're probably just wanting to go out and explore. There's nothing wrong with that, it definitely makes the ride more enjoyable. A hard suspension, which is going to be more along the lines of a cross-country bike to a motocross bike, they're the opposite of that. When you're going slow, they feel terrible. But then when you start to gain speed and you start to really push on them, that's when they start to come into their own. So you have to be pretty honest with yourself and say, am I going to ride slow or am I going to be really fast? And fast to you might not be fast to the suspension manufacturer. So if you can, go ride with some buddies, try different types of suspension and see which one you prefer. That'll give you a better idea of what you actually like. Choosing the right size and feel is super important. There's a lot of examples of this. When I first started riding dirt bikes, I thought they were all too tall or that I was too short. And I realized that no, dirt bikes are just tall because they have to have ground clearance. But if you're any shorter than me, I'm 5'8", you're gonna have more problems touching the ground than I do. And when you're off-road, you typically can't just put your feet down because nothing is flat and straight. Choosing the right bike, size, and fit. If you're somebody who's ridden street bikes your whole life, you're probably thinking, oh, I need to flat foot this thing, otherwise it's too big. Well, that can be the case, and if that's something that you require for your confidence, I'd say go for it. But I will also say that dirt bikes are really, really tall. I cannot flat foot my bike. Not 1 foot, not 2 feet. I basically can only touch, even on the street, with my toe. The reason for that is dirt bikes are just tall because they need a lot of ground clearance. They need to be able to hit the ground after a big jump and absorb all that shock without bottoming out. It is extremely important, especially if you are a beginner, to feel comfortable on the motorcycle. So if you are a beginner, I definitely recommend getting a motorcycle that you feel comfortable on. Doing it the way that I did it, which was just buy a motorcycle and figure it out, you crash a lot. I have crashed so many times that I do not even remember the majority of them. That's dirt bike riding. It's the way it is. But there is something to be said about being confident on your dirt bike. If you are a smaller person, for example, my wife, she is very short. You can buy a Yamaha TTR, very low seat height. You could buy a smaller bike like a pit bike, have a lower seat height, and it's probably still only be able to put 1 foot down. But if you buy a bike like mine, a full-size dirt bike, you're not going to be able to touch at all. Now, even within dirt bikes, ergonomics change. I know this is going to be weird, and it's not something that a beginner might notice, but as you put some time on, you're going to notice. For me, the first time I really truly noticed this was when I went from my KTM to my friend Shirko. A Shirko is more like a Japanese motorcycle, like a Honda or a Kawasaki. It's a much more cramped rider triangle. What I mean by that is that the pegs and the handlebars are actually physically closer together. That was weird to me, and I wanted to buy a Shirko. I was considering it, and then when that happened and I realized I do not like these ergonomics. So that's a no-go for me. Obviously, that's something that comes with experience, and you'll change your mind depending on whether maybe you start on a Shirko or a Yamaha or a more cramped bike. Then maybe you'll get on a KTM that's more spaced out or a Beta that's more spaced out and think, wow, this is really too much. I don't like this. So that's all personal preference, but it's definitely something you want to take into consideration. When you go and look at the motorcycle to purchase, you definitely want to sit on it at the very least. You should test ride it in the parking lot and try and go through all the gears and all that stuff and just make sure it feels right. Now, bear in mind that there is some adjustability with most motorcycles. For example, on my KTM, I can move the handlebars forward about 1 inch. And I don't mean roll them forward, I mean you can physically change where they are mounted, and that makes a big difference. You can also buy different foot pegs that move the feet forward or backwards, and also that makes a big difference. The rider triangle is super important, and the rider triangle on a dirt bike is your feet, and your hands. The seat is not something that you sit on very often. It should be your knees grabbing the bike. But if you're gonna be on the road often, you definitely want that nice comfortable seat. Overall, the feel should be good. A perfect example of this in my experience is I got to ride a YZ250. I love the YZ motorcycle, but I've never owned one. The second I got to ride one, I realized, wow, this motorcycle is extremely aggressive. It is relatively unpredictable because I'm new to it. And it's really hard suspension because it's a motocross bike. It's just not the right bike for me, and that's okay. So it's best to have your own thoughts and your own opinions and not just blindly go into some purchase because some random reviewer said this is the one that you should get. You are you, and what you like is what you like, and that is okay. You don't have to like the same thing as the guy on the internet. You and I are going to like different things, and that's completely fine. On a final note, budget is very important, and it's very easy to blow your budget. I do not recommend buying a new motorcycle as your first bike, or as your second bike, or as your third bike. I recommend buying a used bike because they're cheaper and you don't have to take that depreciation hit. Typically, a used bike has been on the market longer, therefore you can find parts for it easier. A used bike is used. It already has the scratches, dents, and dings that you're going to put onto it, so it's not as big of a deal when you fall over and your brand new bike has a scratch on it. I think it's a great idea to explore beginner-friendly options within your budget, but I also need to point out that if your budget is X, you can't just spend X on your motorcycle, because a helmet and boots are an absolute must for off-road riding. I know you're thinking, well, no duh, a helmet is, but I can use my work boots, right? No, you cannot. I have seen, and I'm not exaggerating, I have seen multiple people ride with work boots and end up with massive cuts on their leg that required them to go to the hospital because work boots just don't protect you off-road. Not only do they not protect you from cuts, they don't protect your ankles at all. And the majority of injuries in off-road riding are to your feet. It is absolutely vital that you wear off-road riding boots. On-road riding boots are soft and plush, and they allow your foot to move. They will not protect your ankle at all. And they don't go high enough to protect you from cuts usually. So when you set your budget with the idea that I have to still buy a helmet and boots. They don't need to be the top tier helmet, and they don't need to be the top tier boots, but you do need to put that into your budget. Now, I definitely recommend buying a new helmet, because when you take a hard fall on a helmet, it compromises the integrity of the outer shell and it's not as safe. But honestly, buying used boots is kind of nice because they're already broken in, and breaking in off-road riding boots sucks. They are really stiff and it takes a really long time to break them in. So, new helmet, used boots. Now we gotta buy the motorcycle with what's left of our budget. There are so many different options of off-road dirt bikes in many different budgets. You can spend $10,000 on a used bike all the way down to like $500. Well, I don't know about now. The market's been crazy right now, but $1,000 to $2,000 or below. You're gonna have to do some work on your bike, which is great because you get to learn how to do it. So you've got a massive range that you can spend. But keep in mind, you do need a new helmet, and consider going on like MX Locker or eBay or something and buying a set of used boots, or just talking to a riding club and saying, hey, does anybody have used boots in this size, any used gear? Because a lot of people have a lot of used gear that they don't use and they just have sitting in their garage. They'd be happy to sell it to you. So all that considered, you set your budget, consider your gear choices, consider the type of riding you're gonna do, and then consider the bike size, engine size that you want. I definitely do not recommend getting a giant 450 if you're beginning. Start on a 250. They're really fun. You'll have more fun on a 250 than you would on a 450. Or if you want a two-stroke, a 125 is good, 150 is good, 300 is great. You just gotta be cautious and understand that all of the two strokes can be really aggressive. So yeah, it's all up to you. This is your choice. I just wanted to make a video to help you be a little bit more informed. So I am trying to grow my channel, and if you thought that this was helpful in any way, do all the things like share, like, and stuff. The best thing you can do to help a content creator that's trying to get their start is to share their video. Obviously, if you have any questions, leave a comment. I'm always in the comments. I'm here for the conversation afterwards. So please go ahead, feel free to leave a comment. And yeah, I really appreciate you watching. That's gonna be it. Hopefully I helped. Hopefully I did something. Hopefully something I said resonated. Hopefully something I said was not completely wrong, and that people won't be really mean in the comments, because that hurts my feelings. Hurts my feelings when people are mean to me. It just does. I don't know why. See you in the next one, guys.